Look, it's June, early June still, and minicamps are over, OTAs are over, everything concluded today in a glorified walkthrough. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the Texans have fixed every single problem because nobody figures anything out, A, practicing without pads on, and B, without facing actual opponents. Not just in the preseason, but in the regular season. But there are some good things, some things that I'm genuinely really excited about. So when it comes to my overall takeaways from minicamps, OTAs in the offseason, I think the first big overarching one is that this isn't a team that feels like it's trying to figure it out anymore. I think they know exactly what their challenges are. I think they know what the solutions should be on the offense, and I think they're heading in the right direction towards that. And a lot of it obviously is going to revolve around the offense and CJ Stroud and them matching not the performance, but the mindset, the attitude, and everything else. And I think the expectations have gone in the last couple of years from those first couple of years, like, hey, yeah, look at that. Hey, we might really have a chance. To last year, you realized, okay, no, they should have a chance, except that the offense is lagging so much. And I think the pressure now is squarely on the football team and specifically the offense to get it right. And I am very consciously not just saying the pressure's on CJ Stroud because there's a lot more to it than that. Right now, the Texans are at 9.5 on their win total on FanDuel, which I think is always a really good idea to take the over on that, as long as the Texans are bringing back just about every one of their starters, plus a couple of improvements. But these expectations, I think if you look at Will Anderson, unabashedly talking about a Super Bowl. Jalen Petrie thinks they've got the best secondary in football. Kamari Lassiter, I loved what he said in his press conference about nobody wanting to be the weak link on that defense and everybody just feeling that pressure to produce and just be sure you're not letting the other guys down. But everybody, look, the defense can feel good about itself in June. We've heard the offense and we've heard the defensive players and the coaches say some things about the offense that I think are real and substantial. And I think the second big takeaway, other than just the feel of the culture and the expectations and everything, is just that the offense is definitely starting from a better place this year. The pre-snap operation was talked about ad nauseum. And it was tough for me because I love the pre-snap operation and everything they're doing with it, except that we've just talked about it so much. And we heard about it from so many people about how, hey, that's what they're focused on. That's what they're improving in. And it sounds like it's no big deal. But the offense last year was they just had to work so hard to make basic football things happen. Getting the ball snapped, not having illegal motions, converting a short yardage or down in the red zone every now and then. A lot of that just starts with the nuts and the bolts of how the quarterback was operating with the offensive line, with their wide receivers. You had rookie wide receivers. You didn't have a viable running back, really. You had Nick Chubb, who's coming off of a ridiculously bad injury still 2 years after the fact. You had Woody Marks, who is still learning how to play in the NFL and also not really being used in the ideal way that you would want to use Woody Marks. And I think a lot of those things they've aged out of some of those issues. David Montgomery coming in is a big difference maker. Especially when you go in without Joe Mixon, you end up without your second and third top tight ends, and you're playing with rookies elsewhere. There were elements of the team last year where it felt almost like the expansion year back in 2002, where you just had so many guys that you were depending on that were either rookies in critical roles, or because of injuries, you just had backups in critical roles. So it was an extreme version of the 2002 Texans, except the defense was much better. We had a solid defense in 2002, but then youth on the offense that was really holding them back, and the absence of Joe Mixon. I think that we won't know until they face Buffalo whether it's genuinely fixed and whether they are genuinely better. They're going to be facing I'm going to do a preview on the Bills, by the way, in a week or two. The really interesting thing about the Bills, to get off on a tangent quickly, is that they're transitioning into more of a 3-4 defense. I think they're gonna have a nose tackle right on Keelan Rutledge. The Texans so far, unless they change this year a lot, they don't play with a nose guard a lot. So if Keelan Rutledge is the center, see, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm assuming Keelan Rutledge is going to be the starting center. Let's say if Keelan Rutledge is the starting center, he's gonna have a nose tackle up in his face on every snap in a way that he wouldn't have had for most of training camp. Maybe he gets in the preseason a little bit, but there's all these little wrinkles and these things that we won't figure out until they get to the regular season. Third big takeaway is that the offensive line is both a question mark, and yet they're the most encouraging question mark. So they've brought in new guys. They've drafted rookies. They've moved guys around. Keelan Rutledge is playing guard. He's playing center. Wyatt Teller is 100% the type of player when he was in his prime that you want on this team. He's had injuries. He hasn't played like he's been at his prime in a year or two, but he seems newly motivated and invigorated and energized. And it's not like he was lazy before or anything, but sometimes having that challenge as a veteran player to come into a new spot and have to prove yourself to your new teammates, that's a real thing. Like I've felt that before. You're a proven player, but you walk in and none of these guys really know you. You got to prove yourself. Braden Smith, re-signing Ed Ingram, re-signing Trent Brown. Those are all guys who share one thing in common, which is they really, really care about run blocking and they're tenacious in it. So we could blame some of the issues last year on Joe Mixon not being back there. But the fact of the matter is, I don't know how much different the rushing attack would have been with Joe Mixon than it was in 2024, where, hey, great, Joe Mixon has 100 yards rushing, and it doesn't feel like they ran the ball well because it was Joe Mixon getting tackled in the backfield a bunch of times and then every now and then having an incredible play. And so they don't need to be the 1990s Cowboys. They don't need 5 Pro Bowlers. They need to be a functioning but nasty offensive line. And I think there's a chance for the first time in a long time that they're actually going to follow through on that. I think a part of it is just simply that Cole Popovich might be a really good offensive line coach. I thought that they improved fundamentally last year. I thought they did the basic things right. They weren't letting, remember in two years ago, any slanting defensive lineman was cause for catastrophe. They hemmed that up about midway through or building up to midway through last season, and they got a lot better in that regard. And I'll credit Nick Caley and Cole Popovich for putting those guys in better positions and having them be better coached. The fourth takeaway, and this is some of what I was saying about the offensive line, except that it extends to the entire offense, is that they want to be more physical on offense. And I think they're going to make progress doing it. I think that there's an element of Foster Moreau's game at tight end. I think the young wide receivers themselves are both perfectly willing to be physical. They've got to improve on their blocking, but rookie wide receivers usually aren't very good blockers. But they definitely, there's a reason that Nick Caserio likes drafting guys from Iowa State like those two. And I think Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins are of the right mindset for that. I think you watched Jaden Higgins last year, and he really wanted to break tackles, and he was gritty with the ball in his hands after the catch, but he still needs to put on a little bit of weight, same way a young Nico Collins did. And it looks like he has. It looks like he's a little bit, you put on a little bit more of those man muscles. Jalen Noel was already big and strong. Woody Marks, for his body weight, very physical player. We've seen him drag much bigger men across the first down marker, in key moments of game. So I don't worry about him at all. But David Montgomery brings something different to the table. They just the short yardage situations last year, where either in the red zone or just in short yardage in general, there were a lot of times where, man, the offensive line didn't get awesome push, but they got enough push. And when D'Amico's telling Caley, hey, run it up the middle again, and they just continually don't get it, it's hard not to think, and I know this is overly simplified, but I'll simplify it. There are a lot of situations last year where life would have been a lot easier down in the red zone if David Montgomery were back there, because he would have converted a first down. He would have converted on the goal line. And if you look at the Texans offense, they were 13th in scoring. Problem was they were not 13th in touchdowns. They had to settle for a lot of field goals. It felt like they were the worst offense in the league at times, but a little bit of that is an illusion because it was that you got so frustrated with them not converting in the red zone. It just felt like, oh, they can't punch it in. I think they're going to be much more adept at that this year. And we're not able to see that part during OTAs and minicamp. They frown upon full bore goal line drills, full tackle goal line drills with no pads on. The NFLPA would not be happy about that. Fifth takeaway, and this isn't something that I necessarily expected to be saying, except I'm going to say it. The defense might actually be better than they were last year. And it's not like that was an impossibility or anything, but I've had it drilled into my head so many times by so many coaches in the NFL. Hey, you never just pick right up where you left off. You never say, okay, look at how good we were last year, so this year we're definitely going to be as good or better. So every time I say this, I start to get a little twinge, like I'm about to get yelled at by Dom Capers or something. I think they're going to be better than they were last year. And if we just start on the back end in the secondary, if they stay healthy, that's always the big asterisk for all of this. If they stay healthy, they should be 20% better in the secondary than they were last year because they have Reed Blankenship as a steady, solid presence next to Kalen Bullock. And there's so many times when you're playing with either a Kayvon Wallace, who'd only been with the team for a few weeks, CJ Gardner-Johnson, who apparently was just going off and doing his own thing. You got Jalen Reed, who's playing as a rookie. He's obviously not going to be like having a veteran back there. There's so many times where A, those guys make mistakes, or B, you have to limit what you do defensively because you have to be careful not to overload the new guy. So when it comes to disguising coverages, or sometimes a guy having to help out or shade over because you're not comfortable with that safety position, that takes a toll over time. And it has to, sometimes it can make you a little bit more predictable. Teams know where to attack. But I think the other thing about it that's really exciting, I think, is that with Blankenship back there, I think the opportunity to really do some funky and fun things with Kalen Bullock comes into play because he's got so much range. And he's a guy that, man, you can have him line up on one half of the field and have him, run completely across the field and up into the flat or something, do some funky Troy Polamalu type stuff with him because he's that gifted and he's that skilled. So that part, just in A, preventing the big plays, but then B, adding a few more wrinkles to the defense that offenses have to think about. I think they're in a much better position to do that right now than they were before. The other part of the additions they made on defense, I think that I've probably neglected Logan Hall and not talked about him enough because I do think he's a good addition that gives you a lot of versatility. The Texans aren't probably going to bring back Danico Autry, but Danico Autry is a guy who is a bigger, beefier defensive end who could rush the passer, but also could come down and play inside on passing downs, play over offensive tackle on a 5 technique, do some things that some of the other guys you might not want doing. And I think he's going to play probably mostly at defensive tackle, at least to start off. But we haven't talked about him as much, partly because the Texans drafted Kaden McDonald. The Kaden McDonald part that's really interesting and exciting is that he, kind of like Reed Blankenship, feels like you're able to put a cherry on top of something that was already really good. That was already an awesome banana split, but now you've got the Reed Blankenship cherry and the 325-pound plus Kaden McDonald cherry, to where you're trying to hem up some of those explosive plays on the back end that were just uncharacteristic when you saw them. But they did, those guys have all talked about how they want to prevent, they want to not prevent as many. They want to prevent the explosive plays better this year. But also Kaden McDonald, with that added mass up inside, that gets you in those situations where you really have to stop the run, where you want to close out a game. You just gotta, you're down by 3 and the opposing offense is just trying to run the clock out. Or if you're down, late in a game like they were last year against New England, they weren't able to stop the run. And at times last year, they had to commit 5 defensive linemen when I don't think they might necessarily wanted to, or maybe they wanted to stay in nickel, but they felt like we need an extra linebacker in there because the D-line just isn't quite big and stout enough. I think that's going to change them for the better, obviously, as long as Kaden McDonald works out, because that's still That's always an unknown. I liked everything I saw from him in OTAs, but it's just that it's no pads. The interior defensive lineman and offensive lineman, I am very careful to almost ignore and not evaluate too heavily in OTAs because there's very little those guys can do without being able to hit people, especially when their calling card is their physicality. So Keelan Rutledge, Fabechi Wiwu, Kaden McDonald, those guys, their calling card is going to be their physicality, their strength, their size, all of that. And you just can't see much of that in the trenches this time of year. The one, I guess the takeaway that I probably should have expected, but that it really hit me when I was out there at an OTA practice was that the roster just feels deeper. And we knew this last year that, hey, like on offense, I mean, on the offensive line during training camp, you had guys who might be backups on a lot of NFL teams competing with other backups to be the starter. And as the Texans were getting whooped over and over again during training camp, I just kept thinking, man, these guys, if these guys get injured, like, what are we going to do then? And there really wasn't a lot of genuine competition. I mean, Juice Scruggs and Laken Tomlinson were competing at left guard for the first half of the season, and the solution ended up being neither of them. It was, okay, let's do our old thing and bring Titus Howard down. I think at tight end, I think at linebacker, it's way more competitive than it was last year. I think in the defensive backfield, a healthy Jalen Smith should make it more competitive at cornerback, because we saw what could happen when one of the defensive backs goes down. When Kamari Lassiter went down, I thought they did a great job of overcoming that. One of the things they did was they played more base 4-3 defense. They just weren't in nickel as much. So that's almost that's replacing Jalen Petrie by just acknowledging that there's nobody quite like Jalen Petrie, so we're just going to go ahead and play our base 4-3. But when Kamari Lassiter went down in the Chargers game for just a series, or when Kamari Lassiter's out versus the Colts, you saw that depth at cornerback was an issue, and I think they've got more potential solutions there, and I think that Jalen Smith is obviously going to be a big part of that. I'm intrigued by Colin Wright, the young safety / nickelback type of guy. And then at linebacker, I mean, we've gone through this before, but there's 5 or 6 different guys I think who could compete. The one area on defense that I'm still just kind of cautiously curious about is backup defensive end. I think Dylan Horton does a really good job as a bigger guy that can stop the run, but okay, how much of a pass rush arsenal does he have in terms of replacing an Autry or a Derek Barnett? I don't know who it's going to be. It might be Dominique Robinson. I mean, Ali Gay's back in the fold. Solomon Byrd had some good moments. There's rookies out there. I think that's one area where there still might be more opportunity for somebody from the outside to come in, depending on how they feel about it at some point. So the questions I still have after a productive spring, I think it was a genuinely productive spring, would be, A, can they just settle in on the 5 best offensive linemen, and how long is that going to take? I'm pretty sure it's going to be Ursary at left tackle. I'd be really surprised if it wasn't. I think at the beginning of the season, it's going to be Wyatt Teller at left guard. I think Ed Ingram is obviously going to be your right guard. I think Braden Smith is going to be the right tackle. The only reservation I have about that is that, man, Trent Brown did some really good things for the Texans, above and beyond what I expected a 350-pound guy with a torn patellar to be able to do at the more advanced stage of his career. So I'm assuming right now that it's going to be Braden Smith, but I think there's a possibility. Maybe that's a genuine competition, but I think they signed Braden Smith. They're planning on him. Trent Brown's had a lot of injury issues in his career, and I wonder if they feel like, all right, listen, we want to be sure we have Trent Brown available as a swing tackle, and we'll see exactly what happens. But we know he'll probably play at some point, but we don't want to have to try to rely on him for 17 games plus the playoffs, because he hasn't really been able to do that all often in his career. And then it's a big year for Blake Fisher as well. So of those positions that I just talked about, who's going to start, I curiously skipped right over the centers, because I think that's might be the most genuinely competitive starting position on the team, other than, if you want to call the the linebacker to replace EJ Speed starter if they're in their base 4-3. It's just those guys end up playing usually about 40 or 50% of the snaps. Those are the two most competitive spots, but can they settle in on the 5 best offensive linemen? No rotating guard experiment to start the season off. And if Keelan Rutledge can earn that starting center spot, that'll be the interesting thing to monitor during camp. Like, early on, everybody's seeing like, okay, who's with the 1s, who's with the 2s, and you probably read too much into it, but you start to get a feel for it over the course of camp, who the actual starter is. And I look forward to that. The run game is going to be a question mark until it isn't. And that we will just have zero clue about until we get to the regular season. I don't know how many total series David Montgomery will even be in there. I think the one thing that I look forward to in training camp where I might say, all right, I don't know how good they're going to be, but I know they're better than they were the last couple of years, is in those preseason games when the starting offensive line is playing, or at least who's ever starting there. There's going to be some things that we can look back to last preseason and the preseason before that were fundamentally flawed at the time. And some of the issues that they had in adjusting to blitzes, adjusting to D-line games, those types of things, it was concerning. The 2 years ago, I had a hard time figuring out exactly what to do with Dameon Pierce because Dameon Pierce didn't look great. Like, I'm thinking of that Pittsburgh game specifically, but at the same time, he really didn't have great blocking in the preseason, except for a couple of his snaps. So it's hard to evaluate those guys when you don't have any kind of good blocking up front. So I would hope that whether it's the starters or the backups, we just see more fundamentally sound football than we've seen the last couple of years. And at this point, I'm optimistic that we will. But that'll be the first real test is, all right, the offensive line and the running backs in the run game. The big one that I haven't even mentioned yet, and you guys know how I feel about Tank Dell. I am pulling for him so hard as a fan. As somebody who analyzes / discusses the Texans, I have to be realistic about it and say that, man, all right, it's going to be a huge accomplishment if he comes back and plays close to the same level of explosiveness, speed, downfield menace that he's capable of being. Just because when you tear 3 ligaments, there's just not. It doesn't happen all that often. And when it does happen, a lot of times it's not a guy who's like the caliber of a Nick Chubb, but it happened to Nick Chubb when he was in college, and he ended up being one of the best running backs in the NFL until he ended up having that second really bad injury later on. Willis McGahee, he's another guy with 3 ligament tears who came back and had a solid NFL career. So it's not like it's impossible or anything. It's just rare. Partly because it's rare to have that catastrophic knee injury, and then it's rare that guys come back and they're as good. But I think Tank's got a few things going for him. For one, modern medicine. So I would just assume that the techniques and everything are evolving all the time, the rehab strategies and everything. And then the fact that Tank Dell's lighter with zero actual medical training or rationale behind this other than force equals mass times acceleration. I feel like Tank, by virtue of him being a smaller guy, should be able to recover from this better. And I will accept no arguments otherwise. And by the way, the Texans -1.5 or +1.5 versus the Bills still. I'm waiting to see if that line moves at all. People come to their senses and ask why. Why? Just because of the addition of DJ Moore, all of a sudden the Bills are going to look good when they play in Houston, Texas, whether it's called NRG Stadium or Reliance Stadium? I'm not accepting it. Not accepting it, FanDuel, but that's where you can get it. At FanDuel, Texans right now are +1.5 to open the season versus the Bills. And then the final one, obviously, is it all comes back to CJ. So I wasn't avoiding CJ. I was genuinely thinking about all these other things. I've grown tired of talking about pre-snap operation, and I've grown tired of discussing what, when, where, how highly paid, everything else that goes into CJ Stroud. But I think that, as it usually is with quarterbacks, a lot of it's on him and overcoming that playoff performance. But it is also on the Texans offense to give him an actual chance to show the best version of himself. I think the stats we've all seen over and over again is that over the course of the last 3 years, CJ's had the worst run support. And even if you're somebody who thinks like, oh, it's established the run is dumb and that's a bygone era, it's coming back into vogue, for one. 2, you never should have completely had that feeling, even when the run game was so out of vogue. But 3, it's that there's one thing. There's a difference between having a viable rushing attack and a horrible rushing attack. If you at least have a viable rushing attack, it creates enough uncertainty in the defense that it allows quarterbacks to do a lot better work. So not just in setting up the play action, but in the personnel they put out there, everything else. It's really, really hard to operate when teams flat out have zero respect for your rushing attack. And that is what CJ's been working with the last few years. When it comes to the nuts and the bolts of operating the offense, I'm optimistic that it's going to look a lot better this year. And you hear time in system. I talked to Bucky Brooks during the season at one point, and he had brought that up. That was early in the season before the first Jaguars game, about just time in system really matters with a quarterback when you're running a system like this. And he's had a lot of time in the system. He had the full OTAs in minicamp this year. So I'm optimistic about CJ. I think, and I'm optimistic about the offense being better. And we'll find out in about 5 weeks just exactly how brilliant and Nostradamus-like I was, or how completely full of crap I was. But either way, I hope you're still here. I hope you subscribe to the Believe in Texans podcast. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify or elsewhere, please leave a 5-star review and anything else. And I will be bringing you every little bit of Texans news that I can scrounge from the interwebs as we enter a black hole of very little football information coming out.